On a cold Tuesday morning in late March of 1922, at an isolated farm called Hinterkaifeck in Bavaria, 63-year-old Andreas Gruber was checking the edge of his land when he found a line of heavy boot prints coming out of the woods and crossing the thawing field toward his buildings. He searched for the tracks leading back out again, but there were none. Tonight there are 10 stories, drawn from different parts of the world, all taking place between 1920 and 1950. There is a light rain falling in the background, and the pace tonight is slow on purpose, meant to help you settle in. Let the day loosen its grip and drift a little closer to sleep while the darker parts of history move quietly past. Before we go any farther, subscribe if you have not already, and leave a comment telling me where you are listening from and what time it is there. I hope you are somewhere safe and comfortable, and the like button is still waiting off to the side, looking polite, patient, and completely harmless. Tap it now before it learns where you live and starts checking your windows. Alright, turn off the lights, settle in, listen to the rain, and go back to that Tuesday morning in Bavaria. Hinterkaifeck stood nearly a kilometer from the nearest neighbor, a tight square of timber and stone buildings crouched against the weather. It was the kind of place where distance felt useful in daylight, and much less useful once the sky began to darken. Andreas knew that property, the way a sailor knows the deck of his own ship. He knew where the fence posts loosened first after a hard winter, where the mud held longest after thaw, and how each barn hinge sounded when the wind shifted. He lived there with his wife Cecilia, their widowed daughter Victoria, and Victoria's 2 children, little Cecilia and Joseph. They worked, ate, and slept by routine. By late March, the snow had begun to pull back from the fields, leaving gray slush, black mud, and strips of dead grass flattened by winter. Andreas walked the perimeter as he often did, checking damage left by the season. He moved slowly, his boots sinking into the wet ground, his eyes passing over fence wire, gate posts, and the dark line of woods along the north edge of the property, until something below him stopped him cold. The prints began at the tree line and moved steadily across the open field toward the machine shed. They were deep and clear, the marks of a grown man wearing heavy boots and walking with purpose. Andreas traced them with his eyes all the way to the back of the outbuilding, then turned around to find the return trail. The field behind him was smooth and empty, with no second line leading back into the forest. He stood there for longer than he would later admit, feeling the wind tug at his coat while he stared at the place where the tracks entered his world. Then he walked to the shed and checked the heavy door. The iron bolt was still in place. He circled the buildings one by one, looking for another route out, another gate, another disturbance in the thawing ground. There was nothing but that single path leading in. Inside the house that evening, the room looked the same as it always did. Bowls sat on the table. Spoons clicked against ceramic. Lamplight settled softly over the walls. Andreas mentioned the tracks in a lower voice than usual, not wanting the children to absorb the shape of his concern. He said it was probably a hunter or some traveler cutting across the land, though even to him the explanation sounded thin. The next morning, he opened the front door and found a newspaper on the porch. It was neatly folded, dry, despite the damp air, and placed where a regular delivery might have left it. No one in the house subscribed to that paper. The post had not yet come through. Andreas brought it inside and asked whether anyone had bought it in town. Victoria looked at it, then at him, and said no in a voice that sounded smaller than usual. Later that afternoon, he went to the kitchen drawer where the spare keys to the outbuildings were kept on a brass ring. He reached into the familiar corner and felt only the smooth wood at the bottom. He checked again, slower this time, then emptied the drawer and searched the shelf beside it. The keys were gone. He moved jars, cloths, and utensils with growing impatience, but the ring did not reappear, and the room itself began to feel less settled around him. That night, the house began making sounds that did not belong to old timber or winter weather. While the others slept, Andreas lay awake, staring into the dark and listening to the ceiling. He heard measured weight moving across the attic floorboards above him. Not a mouse, not a bird, not the restless settling of boards, These were footsteps, slow and deliberate, traveling from one side of the house to the other. He lit a lantern and climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. Dust hung in the air. Dry straw and old crates sat in low stacks beneath the rafters. He lifted the light and swept it through the space, finding nothing but corners and stillness. The little windows were latched from the inside. No person stood there waiting. Even so, when he came down again, he carried back with him the feeling that something had remained behind only by not moving. He spoke to a few neighbors in the village, describing the tracks in the newspaper in his flat, practical way. Some told him to contact the police. But Andreas was not a man who liked inviting outsiders into his affairs. He preferred to handle his own problems. He believed that if someone had crossed onto the land, that person would either reveal himself or leave. What Andreas did not yet understand was that the silence of the farm was already being used against him. On the morning of March 31st, a new maid named Maria Baumgartner arrived at Hinterkaifeck. She came carrying a small trunk and the kind of reserved optimism that belongs to someone starting unfamiliar work. The previous maid had left months earlier, claiming the property was haunted. Maria either did not believe that or needed the wages badly enough to ignore it. She was shown her room near the kitchen and began her duties at once. The day followed the usual rhythm of farm life. Cows were milked, wood was stacked, feed was measured out, the evening meal was prepared. By sunset, the courtyard had taken on that distorted, lengthened look that comes when shadows are doing more work than light. Inside the house, lamps were lit, drawing small circles of yellow against the dark. Outside, the valley settled into the kind of quiet that can sound complete until it is broken. At some point that night, members of the family began leaving the house and moving toward the barn. No one can say with certainty what drew them out. A noise in the stable, perhaps. A door swinging loose in the wind. An animal shifting in distress. Something ordinary enough to answer. They crossed the yard one by one, boots pressing into gravel and mud, stepping away from the lamplight and into the barn shadows without knowing who had reached them first. What happened inside the barn stayed hidden from the rest of the valley. No shout carried far enough to alarm a neighbor. No one came running across the fields with a lantern. The silence of the farm simply deepened. In the stalls, the cattle shifted and breathed into the cold. Inside the house, the lamps burned lower and lower until the rooms went dark. From a distance, Hinterkaifeck would have looked as if it had settled naturally into sleep. The following morning, the first signs of absence appeared in the village. The children did not show up at school. Their places remained empty through the lesson, which was unusual enough to be noticed. A neighbor passing the lane saw that smoke was not rising from the chimney. Another observed that the post had started to collect. Each detail was small on its own, but together they formed a quiet pattern, the outline of a household no longer keeping time with itself. By the third day, a repairman named Hans Kirovsky arrived at the farm to fix a machine, just as he had arranged earlier. He knocked on the heavy door and waited. No answer. He walked around the yard, calling for Andreas and Victoria, hearing only wind and livestock. The barn doors were shut, but the animals inside sounded restless and hungry. Hans left for the village with that uneasy feeling that comes when ordinary neglect points to something less ordinary. He returned with several local men, all of them carrying lanterns as the afternoon light began to fail. They approached the property slowly, with the hesitation of people who already suspected they would not like what they were about to find. They entered the barn first to check the animals. Deeper inside, beneath scattered straw and a heavy wooden door laid flat over the top, they found the first 4 bodies hidden together. Andreas, his wife, his daughter, and the older child had been placed there in a grim ordered cluster. The men backed out of the barn with broken, ragged breath and then forced themselves into the house. Inside, they found Maria in her bedchamber. In the small nursery, they found little Joseph still in his crib. The farm that had seemed merely too quiet from a distance had become something else entirely once its doors were opened. Police arrived from Munich the next day under Inspector Georg Reingruber and began a methodical search of the property. They looked for theft, revenge, signs of forced entry, and anything that could narrow motive. But the house had not been ransacked. Money remained in place. Jewelry had not been taken. Drawers still held what they should have held. This was not a robbery that had gone wrong. It was something colder and more deliberate than that. Then the investigators entered the kitchen and found the detail that disturbed them most. The stove had been used after the family was gone. Fresh food had been prepared. Several beds showed signs of having been slept in. Outside, the cattle had been fed and milked. Whoever had taken over the farmstead had not fled into the dark afterward. The person responsible had remained in the house, moving through those rooms as if they had every right to be there. That image is the one that stays. A person calmly tending animals, warming himself by the family fire, eating bread from the family table, all while the people who belong to those things lay only yards away. It suggests a kind of detachment that is difficult to fit inside any ordinary idea of a human mind. A farm is built on rhythm, repetition, and trust in the next task. Someone at Hinterkaifeck understood that rhythm well enough to disappear inside it. Investigators would eventually conclude that the intruder had likely entered through a hatch near the machine shed and used the attic space to watch the family through gaps in the floorboards. From there, he could have heard conversations, followed routines, and waited for the right moment. The footsteps Andreas heard above his head were not imagination, and they were not harmless. They were the sounds of a stranger already inside the life he thought he understood. The weapon was identified as a mattock from the farm itself, a heavy tool made for breaking hard ground. It had been cleaned and returned to the shed. That detail only deepened the sense that the killer was familiar with both the property and the labor it demanded. Over the years, police interviewed more than 100 suspects, including farmhands, acquaintances, rejected suitors, and drifters moving through a Germany still unsettled by war. Every lead thinned out and failed. Some investigators turned to behavioral theory. Others, in a more desperate age, even consulted clairvoyance. Nothing closed the gap. The motive remained uncertain. The identity remained uncertain. What stayed certain was the shape of those prints in the thawing snow and the impossible fact that the person who made them seemed to have arrived from the woods without ever truly having left again. In the years that followed, the extended family decided the land could not be lived on. The memory had settled too deeply into the timber and soil. In 1923, the buildings of Hinterkaifeck were torn down stone by stone, board by board, until the farm was gone and only a flattened stretch of ground remained. What had once been a self-contained world of chores, meals, and lamplight was reduced to open field and weather. Today, the site is marked only by a small monument standing in farmland beneath the same wide Bavarian sky. The woods are still there. Winter still presses its weight into the drifts. Wind still crosses the field with nothing to stop it. There are no more buildings left to gather around the cold. Only the memory of a family that vanished from ordinary life after mistaking a warning in the snow for something that could wait until morning. As the year 2026 moves on, the case remains officially unsolved. Modern analysts have revisited the files and studied the behavior of the unknown killer, but the space where a name should be is still empty. Some believe it was a neighbor with a grievance. Others suspect a transient moving through the country after the war. None of it resolves the central fact that someone lived above that family before stepping fully into their home. The prints that led in from the woods were never matched to any living soul. That is the final image the case leaves behind. A man sees tracks and expects a trespasser, a drifter, perhaps an inconvenience. Instead, he is looking at the first visible sign that the boundary around his home has already failed. Hinterkaifeck ends not with an arrest or confession, but with a set of footprints stopping at a door that was never safe again. That is what lingers, not only the violence, but the stillness that came before it, and the ordinary sounds that kept going while something impossible waited just overhead. The cold of that Bavarian field does not end at the edge of the farm. It reaches much farther than that. It settles into any familiar place, where the air changes slightly, and where a room begins, for no clear reason, to feel occupied. Somerton Beach in Adelaide, South Australia, was beginning to warm under the early morning sun on the 1st of December, 1948. At 6:30, the tide was low, leaving a wide stretch of damp, packed sand that smelled of salt and decaying seaweed. A few locals were already out, walking their dogs or taking a morning swim before the heat of the day became oppressive. The water was a pale, glassy blue, barely moving against the shore. A young couple walking along the shoreline noticed a figure resting against a low stone seawall. The man was dressed in a well-tailored suit, which seemed out of place for a morning at the beach. He was sitting with his legs extended and his head leaning back against the masonry, as if he had simply stopped to take a nap while watching the waves. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, despite the formal nature of his trousers and his polished shoes. When the couple moved closer, they realized the man was not breathing. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood on the sand, and no footprints other than their own nearby. He appeared to be about 45 years old, with an athletic build and broad shoulders. His face was calm, almost peaceful, showing no indication of pain or distress. He looked like someone who had just finished a long day of work and had decided to rest his eyes for a moment. The local police arrived shortly after 7, led by Detective John Lyons. He began his examination by checking the man's pockets, expecting to find a wallet or some form of identification. Instead, he found an unused second-class rail ticket to the city, a bus ticket, a pack of chewing gum, a box of matches, and 2 metal combs. There was no money, no driver's license, and no letters. The man was a complete stranger to the quiet sands of Somerton. Detective Lyons noticed a small detail that felt out of alignment with a normal morning. Every single label had been meticulously removed from the man's clothing. His coat, his shirt, and even his undergarments bore the scars where tags had been sliced away with a sharp blade. It was as if the man had intentionally sought to erase any trace of where his clothes had been purchased or who he might be. He was a man without a brand, a physical blank space. The body was moved to the Royal Adelaide Hospital for a full autopsy. The pathologist, John Dwyer, noted that the man's pupils were small and unusual, and there was blood in his stomach. His spleen was 3 times the normal size, and his liver was congested with blood. These were signs that suggested the presence of a powerful toxin, something that could stop a heart without leaving a visible struggle on the surface. Yet, the chemical tests came back negative for all known poisons. The mystery deepened when a brown suitcase was discovered at the Adelaide railway station, having been checked in the day before the body was found. Inside were more clothes, with the labels removed, a stenciling brush, a zinc-coated table knife, and a spool of orange thread that was not available in Australia. The thread matched a repair found on the man's trouser pocket. This suitcase confirmed the man had traveled to the city, but it offered no name. Months passed without a single person coming forward to claim the body. The police decided to create a plaster cast of the man's head and shoulders to keep a permanent record of his features before burial. It was during a final, microscopic search of the man's clothing that an investigator discovered a tiny, hidden watch pocket sewn into the waistband of his trousers. Deep inside that pocket was a small, tightly rolled scrap of paper. On the scrap were printed 2 words in an ornate, foreign script, Tamam Shud. A local scholar identified the phrase as Persian, meaning ended or finished. It was the final phrase from a rare collection of poems called the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. The police now had a clue, but it was a literary one. They began a public appeal to find the specific book from which this tiny piece of paper had been torn, hoping it would lead them to an owner. A man eventually came forward, claiming he had found a copy of the book on the back seat of his car, which had been parked near the beach on the night the stranger died. When the police examined the book, they found the page with the final words missing. On the back cover, there were 5 lines of capital letters that appeared to be a secret code. Beneath the code was a phone number belonging to a nurse who lived just a few blocks from Somerton Beach. The nurse, a woman named Jessica Thompson, was interviewed by the detectives. She admitted she had owned a copy of the book, but had given it away years earlier to a man she knew during the war. When the police showed her the plaster cast of the stranger's face, Her reaction was immediate and visceral. She nearly fainted, her eyes widening as she stared at the white features. "I have never seen this man before," she insisted, but her voice was trembling. Despite her denial, the police remained suspicious. Thompson lived close enough to the beach that the man could have walked to her house in minutes. She seemed to be hiding a connection that she was terrified to acknowledge. The detectives watched her hands as she spoke, noting how she avoided looking at the cast a second time. Sometimes the most organized lives are the ones hiding the deepest fractures, and Thompson's quiet life seemed to be holding a great weight. The investigation eventually stalled. The code in the back of the book was sent to naval intelligence and codebreakers around the world, but no one could decipher the string of letters. Without a name or a clear cause of death, the man was buried in a grave marked simply as the Unknown Man. For decades, his image remained a ghost in the Australian archives, a symbol of the secrets that were carried into the ground during the early days of the Cold War. In the year 2022, a researcher named Derek Abbott used advanced DNA sequencing to finally give the man a name. By extracting genetic material from the hair trapped in the plaster cast, he identified the stranger as Carl Webb, an electrical instrument maker from Melbourne. Webb had disappeared from his life months before, leaving behind a wife and a job. He was a real person with a real history, but the reason for his journey remained lost. The identification of Carl Webb answered who he was, but it did not explain why he ended up on a beach with no labels on his clothes and a secret code in his pocket. There was no record of him being a spy, yet the circumstances of his death were identical to the tradecraft of the era. His wife had claimed he was a quiet man who enjoyed poetry, which might explain the book, but it did not explain the toxin that left no trace in his blood. As of 2026, the case of the man at Somerton is considered a closed chapter in terms of identity, but an open wound in terms of truth. The police files remain available to the public, and the code on the back of the book is still studied by amateur cryptographers. Carl Webb's body was exhumed for the DNA testing, and he has since been reinterred with a headstone that finally bears his name, ending his long tenure as a ghost. The sand at Somerton continues to shift with the tides, erasing the footprints of the thousands of people who walk there every day. The stone wall where Carl Webb was found is still there, a silent witness to a moment of total isolation. The mystery of the labels and the hidden scrap of paper remains a reminder that even in a world of records and names, a person can choose to become a shadow, leaving behind only the cold traces of an ended story. The silence that Carl Webb took to his grave is a specific kind of quiet, one that suggests a life intentionally hidden from the light. It is the same silence that greeted the boys who climbed an ancient tree in a wood thousands of miles away. They were looking for the simple, ordinary things of childhood, but instead, they found a secret that had been growing in the dark for a long time. We move now to the heavy, gray skies of wartime England. Hagley Wood in Worcestershire felt like a separate world from the war that was tearing across Europe in the spring of 1943. The trees stood thick and gray under a heavy morning sky, their branches interlocked in a way that blocked out the distant drone of aircraft. Robert Hart walked through the damp undergrowth, his boots making a soft, rhythmic sound against the carpet of dead leaves and moss that covered the forest floor. He was not supposed to be there, and neither were the three boys trailing behind him. They were poachers, searching for bird nests and the occasional rabbit to help fill the empty spaces on their families' dinner tables. The woods were private land, part of the Hagley Hall estate, but the boys knew the winding paths and the hidden gaps in the fences. To them, the risk of a run-in with a gamekeeper was a small price to pay for a successful morning of hunting. The air was still, holding the scent of wet earth and ancient bark. Robert led the group toward a particularly large wych elm tree that stood like a skeletal sentinel in a small clearing. It was a massive, gnarled thing, its trunk twisted by age, and its center hollowed out by decades of slow decay. The boys had seen the tree many times before, but today it seemed to command their attention in a different way, its gray limbs reaching out toward the overcast sky. Bob Farmer, the most adventurous of the group, decided to climb the elm to see if any nests were hidden in its upper reaches. He gripped the rough, fissured bark and pulled himself upward, his breathing heavy in the quiet air. The rest of the boys stood at the base, looking up as Bob reached a fork in the branches. You can feel the rough wood pressing against your palms, and the cool dampness of the moss as the silence of the woods begins to feel much heavier. Bob peered down into the dark, hollowed-out cavity of the main trunk. He expected to see a collection of twigs, or perhaps a stray feather from a wood pigeon. Instead, his eyes adjusted to the dim light and settled on a pale, rounded object wedged deep within the wood. It was smooth and ivory-colored, standing out sharply against the rotting interior of the tree. He reached down, thinking he had found a prize, and his fingers brushed against cold, hard bone. He pulled the object out and held it up to the gray light of the morning. It was a human skull. The jaw was missing, and a few stray patches of dark hair still clung to the side of the cranium. The empty eye sockets stared back at him with a hollow, unblinking intensity. "I need to put this back right now," he thought, his stomach turning over as the reality of the find began to sink in. He gingerly lowered the skull back into the hollow and climbed down. The boys stood in a tight circle, their earlier excitement replaced by a cold, prickling fear. They spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward the dark woods around them. They were terrified of the police, but they were more terrified of the secret they had just uncovered. They made a pact to tell no one about the tree, fearing that reporting the find would reveal their poaching and lead to severe punishment for their families during such a difficult time. But secrets have a way of growing when they are kept in the dark. The image of the skull followed the boys home, appearing in the corners of their rooms and in the silence of their evening meals. Eventually, the youngest of the group, Thomas Willits, could no longer bear the weight of it. He told his parents what they had seen in Hagley Wood, and by the next morning, the local police were marching through the undergrowth toward the ancient witch elm. The investigators arrived with heavy tools and lanterns to properly examine the tree. They found the skull exactly where Bob had left it. But as they searched deeper into the hollow, they realized it was not an isolated find. They recovered a nearly complete human skeleton, the bones fragile and stained by the tannins in the wood. The body had been forced into the trunk, with the limbs positioned in a way that suggested the person had been placed there shortly after death. Along with the bones, the police recovered several physical items that offered a glimpse into the life that had been ended. There was a single crepe-soled shoe, a small gold wedding ring made of cheap alloy, and fragments of clothing that had rotted away over time. The most striking find was a piece of taffeta cloth that had been stuffed deep into the mouth of the skull. It was a concrete sign that this had not been a peaceful passing, but a deliberate act. The forensic examination was led by Professor James Webster. He determined that the remains belonged to a woman in her late 20s or early 30s who had been dead for at least 18 months. This placed her death in October of 1941, a time when the region was under the constant threat of air raids. She had stood about 5 feet tall and had given birth at least once. Despite these details, her name remained as absent as the air in the hollow tree. The police searched through the local missing persons reports, looking for anyone who matched the description of the woman in the woods. They interviewed hundreds of people in the surrounding villages, asking if anyone remembered a woman who had suddenly stopped appearing at the market or the pub. Every lead seemed to vanish into the fog of the war. Thousands of people were displaced, and a single disappearance could easily go unnoticed in the chaos of the bombings. The case began to grow cold, and the bones were placed into storage at a laboratory in Birmingham. The ancient witch elm remained in the clearing, its hollow center now empty and exposed to the elements. For nearly a year, the story of the woman in the tree was a quiet tragedy, known only to the investigators and the local residents who whispered about it over their fences. That changed in early 1944 when the first message appeared on a wall. It was written in white chalk on a brick building in Old Hill. The letters were large and blocky, asking a question that sent a shiver through the community. Who put Bella in the witch elm? There had been no public mention of the name Bella in any of the official police reports or newspaper articles. The name seemed to come from nowhere, yet it was delivered with a strange, taunting confidence. It was as if someone was watching the investigation from the shadows. Soon, similar graffiti began to appear across the region. The messages were found on walls in Birmingham, on monuments in the countryside, and near the entrance to Hagley Wood itself. The wording was always the same, and the handwriting never varied. The name Bella became the primary identity of the victim, despite the lack of any official confirmation. It was a name that felt both intimate and haunting, a label given to a ghost by an anonymous hand. I believe there is a specific type of cruelty in giving a victim a name only after they have been forgotten by the world. The graffiti did not provide answers. It only deepened the sense of unease. The police monitored the sites where the messages appeared, hoping to catch the person with the chalk, but the writer was as elusive as the woman in the tree. The question continued to haunt the stone walls of the city, a persistent reminder of a crime without a face. A new theory began to emerge, suggesting that the victim might have been a foreign national. A woman named Anna from the West Midlands reported that she had known a Dutch woman named Bella who had been involved in an espionage ring. This woman had supposedly disappeared in 1941 after becoming a liability to her handlers. The idea of a wartime spy being executed and hidden in a hollow tree fit the atmosphere of the era, but there was no evidence to prove it. Another lead came from a man who claimed his cousin had been involved in a dark, occult ritual in the woods. He suggested that the positioning of the body and the choice of the wych elm were symbolic, part of a tradition that the local villagers preferred not to discuss. The police investigated these claims of witchcraft, but they found no physical traces of ritualistic behavior at the site. The taffeta in the mouth suggested a much more grounded and brutal motive. In the decades that followed, the mystery only grew more layered. The original bones, which had been stored in a laboratory for further study, were lost. During a transition between facilities, the remains of the woman from the woods simply vanished from the official records. Without the physical evidence, modern forensic testing was impossible. The case was effectively frozen in time, preserved only by the graffiti that continued to appear intermittently over the years. In 1999, the original wych elm tree was destroyed in a storm. The hollow trunk that had held the secret for so long was splintered and scattered across the forest floor. Today, only a small clearing remains where the tree once stood. The woods have grown back around the site, and the paths used by the boys in 1943 have been reclaimed by the undergrowth. The silence of Hagley Wood is now complete, unbothered by the hunting of poachers. The story of the woman in the tree remains one of the most enduring unsolved mysteries in English history as we move through the year 2026. Forensic historians have recently utilized digital archives to cross-reference wartime records with the physical descriptions provided by Professor Webster. Some researchers believe they have identified a woman named Edith who went missing from a nearby town, but the lack of DNA evidence means this is only a theory. The identity of the person who wrote the graffiti has also never been revealed. Some believe it was a local resident who knew the truth but was too afraid to go to the police, while others think it was the killer himself, enjoying the lasting power of his act. The messages have largely stopped appearing on the walls of the city, but the question itself has become part of the local folklore, a cold refrain that is whispered whenever the wind moves through the oaks. The wych elm is gone, but the absence it created in the lives of those who knew the victim remains. Somewhere, perhaps, a family still wonders why a daughter or a mother never came home from the market on a gray afternoon in 1941. The secret of the woods is a heavy thing, a physical trace of a life that was compressed into a dark space and left for the birds to find. The truth is buried in the earth of Worcestershire, silent and still. The hollow space inside that ancient tree held a secret for 18 months before a boy looked inside, and in that moment, the ordinary world shifted into something much colder. It is the same kind of shift that happens when a routine task, like serving a drink or closing a bank, becomes the gateway to a tragedy. We leave the gray woods of England behind and travel across the ocean to the bustling streets of Tokyo, where a different kind of shadow was waiting. The sun was dipping low over the skyline of Tokyo on the 26th of January, 1948. A bitter wind swept through the Shinamachi district, rattling the windows of the small shops that were beginning to close for the evening. Inside the Teikoku Bank, the atmosphere was quiet and professional, a sharp contrast to the cold and chaotic streets of the post-war city outside. The bank was a place of rigid routine. The 16 people inside, including the staff and the families of some employees, were finishing their final tasks of the day. They were surrounded by the familiar sounds of paper rustling, the rhythmic clicking of the abacus, and the low murmur of polite conversation. It was a space defined by order and predictability, where every yen was accounted for. The employees were mostly young men and women who took great pride in their positions. They worked under the watchful eye of the branch manager, who sat at a large mahogany desk near the back of the room. As the clock on the wall neared the hour of closing, the clerks began to organize their ledgers and secure the cash drawers. There was a shared sense of relief that the workday was coming to an end. In the corner of the lobby, a few children were sitting quietly on a wooden bench. They were waiting for their parents to finish their shift so they could walk home together through the darkening streets. The children played with small wooden toys, their laughter muffled by the high ceilings and the heavy drapes. The bank felt like a fortress of normalcy in a city that was still struggling to rebuild. The post-war occupation had brought many changes to Japan, and the sight of officials in uniforms was a common occurrence. People had learned to follow instructions without question, especially when they came from individuals who appeared to represent the new authorities. This habit of obedience was a survival mechanism, a way to navigate a world that had been turned upside down by conflict. The air inside the bank smelled of ink and old paper, a dry and comforting scent that signaled the stability of the institution. A clerk moved across the floor to adjust a lamp, the light reflecting off the polished brass fixtures. The rhythmic thumping of a stamp against a pad filled the intervals between the distant sounds of traffic outside. It was a Tuesday evening like any other. The manager looked at his pocket watch and signaled to the junior clerk to prepare the heavy iron bolts on the front doors. They would soon be turning the sign to indicate the bank was closed to the public. The staff members began to put on their coats, their movements efficient and practiced. They spoke of the cold weather and the hope for a quiet dinner once they reached their homes. One of the tellers was busy counting a final stack of notes, her fingers moving with a speed that only came from years of repetition. She did not look up when the bell above the door chimed, assuming it was a late customer, or perhaps a delivery. The sound was a small, bright note in the hushed room. She expected a quick transaction followed by the final click of the lock. Just as the heavy doors were being prepared for the final lock, a man stepped inside from the cold. He was dressed in a way that commanded immediate respect, wearing a clean suit and a bright red armband that indicated he was an official. He did not look like a customer or a common visitor. He looked like someone who carried the authority of the government in his very posture. He introduced himself as a doctor, a representative of the United States Occupation Authorities. He presented a business card that seemed perfectly legitimate to the bank manager. The man spoke with a calm, clinical voice that left no room for doubt. He explained that a case of dysentery had been discovered in a house only a few blocks away, and everyone in the bank was at risk. The manager greeted the official with a polite bow, taking the card and reading the name of a well-known epidemiologist. The stranger explained that the city was facing a potential outbreak and that he had been sent to provide an immediate preventative treatment. He spoke with the confidence of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed by everyone he encountered during his day. The man reached into his bag and pulled out 2 glass bottles and a set of small ceramic cups. He moved with a practiced, medical precision that suggested years of training. He explained that the preventative medicine had to be taken in 2 specific doses to be effective. The bank employees and their children lined up obediently, trusting the word of a man who looked like he was there to save them. He poured a clear liquid into the first cup and handed it to the manager. He watched closely as the man drank, then proceeded to fill the cups for the rest of the group. He instructed them to swallow the liquid quickly and then wait exactly 1 minute before taking the second dose. You can feel the cool ceramic against your lips and the strange, metallic taste of the fluid as it hits your tongue. The stranger stood with his hands behind his back, his eyes moving from person to person as they finished their drinks. He seemed to be timing the process in his head, his expression remaining neutral and observant. The room was deathly quiet as the 16 people waited for the medicine to take effect. There was no reason to be suspicious of a man who was simply doing his job. Within seconds, the silence was replaced by the sound of coughing. The manager was the first to stagger, his hand reaching out to grab the edge of his desk before his legs gave way. The others began to feel a sharp, burning sensation in their chests and a sudden, overwhelming weakness. The second dose remained in the bottles, untouched, as the people in the bank began to collapse. The medicine was not a cure, but a highly concentrated form of cyanide. The man watched with cold detachment as 12 of the 16 people fell to the floor in agony. The children were not spared. As the victims struggled for air, the stranger did not offer any assistance. He simply waited for the movements to stop, his clinical gaze never wavering from the people he had poisoned. Once the room had become still, the man moved toward the cash drawers. He did not rush, and he did not show any signs of panic. He ignored the large stacks of high-value notes and instead gathered a relatively small amount of cash and several checks. He placed the money in his bag, straightened his suit, and walked out of the front door, vanishing into the cold Tokyo evening. One of the survivors, a woman who had managed to vomit some of the liquid, crawled toward the street to find help. When the police and medical teams arrived, they found a scene that looked like a laboratory accident. The dead were scattered across the lobby, their faces contorted by the speed and violence of the toxin. The investigation was handed over to the city's top detectives. The primary lead was the business card the killer had left behind. It belonged to a real doctor named Shigeru Matsui, who was quickly located and cleared of any involvement. Dr. Matsui informed the police that he had exchanged cards with many people over the previous months. He provided a list of everyone who had received his card, and the detectives began the long process of tracking them down. Among the names was Sadamichi Hirasawa, a well-known watercolor painter. When the police visited his home, they found that he could not produce the business card he had received from Dr. Matsui. Hirasawa claimed he had lost it when his wallet was stolen, but the investigators found his explanation suspicious. They also discovered that he had recently deposited a large sum of money into his account. As the detectives dug deeper, they began to suspect that the crime required a level of expertise that a painter would not possess. The way the poison was handled and the specific choice of the chemical suggested someone with a background in military science. They began to look into the members of Unit 731, a notorious biological warfare group that had operated during the war. The suspicion was that a former military chemist had committed the robbery to fund a new life. However, the American occupation authorities were protective of the former members of Unit 731 as they were interested in the research the unit had conducted. The police were pressured to focus their investigation elsewhere, and their attention returned to the watercolor painter Hirasawa. Sadamichi Hirasawa was arrested and subjected to intense interrogation for weeks. He eventually provided a confession, though he later claimed it had been beaten out of him by the police. Despite the lack of physical evidence linking him to the bank and the fact that several survivors failed to identify him in a lineup, he was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging. The trial was highly controversial, with many legal experts arguing that the evidence was entirely circumstantial. The painter maintained his innocence until the day he died, and his case became a focal point for those fighting against the death penalty in Japan. I find it difficult to understand how a man could be held for decades on the basis of a confession that he had so publicly retracted. Hirasawa remained on death row for 39 years, becoming the longest-serving death row inmate in the world. During his time in prison, he continued to paint, producing works that were often somber and haunting. Every minister of justice who held office during those decades refused to sign his execution order, citing the lingering doubts about the fairness of his original trial. He died of natural causes in 1987 at the age of 95. His death did not end the legal battle, as his family and supporters continued to file appeals for a posthumous retrial. They argued that the true killer was someone with government protection, a professional who knew how to use poison as a tool of war rather than a common instrument of theft. The Teikoku Bank incident remains a dark stain on the history of Tokyo, a reminder of a time when the lines between medicine and murder were blurred by the chaos of occupation. The survivors carried the weight of that Tuesday evening for the rest of their lives. Their trust in authority permanently shattered by the man with the red armband and the ceramic cups. As of 2026, the family of Sadamichi Hirasawa is currently pursuing their 21st appeal for a retrial. Modern forensic experts have analyzed the descriptions of the poison's effects and concluded that the toxin was likely a specific chemical compound that was only available to military researchers at the time. This new evidence supports the theory that Hirasawa was a convenient scapegoat. The small ceramic cups from the bank are now kept in a police archive, the surfaces still holding the traces of a crime that was executed with surgical precision. The building that housed the Teikoku Bank has since been replaced by a modern office tower, but the story of the doctor who was not a doctor continues to be told in the quiet corners of the Shinamachi district. The poison in the bank was a betrayal of the most basic human trust, a calculated act that turned a gesture of health into a sentence of death. It left behind an emptiness that no legal verdict could ever truly fill. That same sense of cold, clinical detachment is found in our next story, where a victim was left in a locked room in a way that defied the laws of biology. The Atlas district of Stockholm was a maze of gray stone buildings and narrow streets that felt heavy under the weight of a damp May in 1932. The spring air carried the scent of wet soot and the distant, metallic tang of the harbor. For the people living in the small apartments of the Sankt Eriksplan area, life was a series of predictable movements between work and home. Lily Lindström was 32 years old and lived in a small, one-room flat on the ground floor of a building in the Atlas area. She was a woman who valued a certain level of order in her small space. Her furniture was modest but well-kept, and she spent much of her day ensuring that her few belongings were arranged with a functional precision that made the room feel larger than it was. Her life was defined by the visitors she received in the evening. Lily made her living as a call girl, a profession that required her to be both discreet and highly observant of the people who crossed her threshold. She had a regular clientele who appreciated her quiet nature and the cleanliness of her apartment. To her neighbors, she was simply a woman who worked late and kept her curtains drawn. Her best friend, a woman named Mimi, who lived just a few doors down, often stopped by for a cup of coffee in the late afternoon. They would sit near the small window, watching the shadows lengthen across the cobblestones outside. Mimi noticed that Lily was a creature of habit, always placing her coffee cup in the same spot and smoothing out the fabric of the tablecloth before she sat down. On the evening of May 4th, the two women spoke briefly in the hallway. Lily seemed her usual self, though she mentioned she was expecting a guest later that night. She was wearing a simple dress and had her hair pinned back in the practical style she favored. There was nothing in her voice or her manner that suggested anything other than the start of another routine evening in the Atlas district. The building was quiet that night, with only the distant sound of a tram and the occasional footstep in the corridor. Mimi went to bed early, knowing that Lily's work often continued into the early hours of the morning. The curtains in Lily's ground floor window were pulled tight, as they always were when she was with a client, casting a soft, yellow glow onto the sidewalk outside. The following morning, the sun rose over Stockholm, but the curtains in Lily's apartment did not open. Mimi walked past the door on her way to the market, noticing that the milk bottle had not been taken inside. She thought perhaps Lily was sleeping in after a particularly long night, a common occurrence in their line of work. She continued on her way, the morning air feeling crisp and unremarkable. By the afternoon of May 6th, the milk bottle was still sitting on the floor in the hallway, and a second one had been placed beside it. Mimi knocked on the door, but there was no sound of movement from within. She leaned her ear against the wood, listening for the rhythmic tick of the clock or the sound of the kettle, but the silence from the apartment was heavy and absolute. Mimi began to feel a slow, cold pressure in her stomach. She knew Lily was not the type of person to leave her mail or her deliveries unattended. She contacted the building's landlord and expressed her concerns. He arrived with a heavy ring of keys, his face set in a look of mild annoyance at being disturbed. He knocked loudly, his voice echoing in the narrow corridor as he called out Lily's name. When there was still no response, the landlord selected the key for apartment number 5. He turned the lock, expecting to find Lily perhaps unwell or simply away on an unannounced trip. The door opened only a few inches before it was stopped by the security chain on the inside. He peered through the gap, but the room was dark, and the air that drifted out was stale and held a faint, metallic odor. The police were called to the scene shortly after. 2 officers arrived and used a tool to cut through the chain, allowing the door to swing fully open. They stepped into the small room, their boots clicking on the wooden floor. The apartment was tidy, exactly as Lily always kept it. A lamp was still burning on the bedside table, its light flickering slightly in the draft from the open door. On a chair near the bed, a set of clothes had been folded with extreme care. The dress, the undergarments, and the stockings were arranged in a neat stack, as if someone had prepared them for the next day. This level of order was typical for Lily, but the fact that they were sitting there while the room remained silent felt like a misalignment in the natural order of the apartment. The officers moved toward the bed. Lily was lying face down on the mattress, her body positioned in a way that suggested she was sleeping. She was entirely nude, her skin appearing unusually pale in the yellow light of the lamp. "This isn't right," the officer thought, the phrase flashing through his mind like a cold spark as he realized that her skin was cold and as stiff as the wooden frame of the bed. Upon closer inspection, the officers saw that Lily's skull had been crushed by several heavy blows from a blunt object. There was surprisingly little blood on the sheets, which struck the investigators as highly unusual given the severity of the head injuries. They searched the room for a weapon, but the only items on the bedside table were a glass of water and the still burning lamp. The lead detective arrived and began a systematic search of the space. He noted that the door had been locked from the inside with the chain in place, meaning the visitor had either exited through a window or possessed a way to secure the chain from the outside. He looked at the window latches, finding them all firmly shut. The apartment was a sealed box, containing only the victim and her folded clothes. A medical examiner was summoned to perform a preliminary assessment. He turned Lily's body over, and his expression changed from professional curiosity to a deep, visible shock. He had seen many crime scenes in Stockholm, but he had never encountered a body in this condition. He leaned in closer, his gloved hands moving across the victim's skin, looking for something that should have been there but wasn't. The examiner looked at the detective and spoke in a low, restrained voice. He explained that Lily had been subjected to a total exsanguination. Every drop of blood had been drained from her body. There were no large pools on the floor and no saturation in the mattress. The visitor had removed the life force of the woman with a level of efficiency that defied the messy reality of a typical act. The search of the kitchen area revealed a collection of ordinary household items. There were plates in the cupboard and a few pieces of fruit in a bowl. However, sitting on the small wooden table was a silver gravy ladle. The detective picked it up, noticing that the bowl of the spoon was coated in a dark, dried substance. He held it up to the light and saw the unmistakable brownish tint of dried blood. The presence of the ladle suggested a terrifying possibility. The visitor had not just drained the blood, they had used the kitchen utensil to collect it. The detective looked around the clean, orderly apartment and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the May weather. The idea that someone had sat in this room and consumed the blood of the victim was a detail that did not fit any known criminal pattern. Saliva was found on Lily's neck and body, confirming that the visitor had been in intimate contact with her before or during the act. The police began to track down every man who had visited the apartment in the weeks leading up to the murder. They interviewed businessmen, laborers, and sailors, but each person had a solid alibi or lacked the specific, dark temperament required for such an act. The fingerprints found in the apartment belonged mostly to Lily and her friend Mimi. The visitor had been careful, perhaps wearing gloves or ensuring they touched nothing that would leave a trace. The only physical evidence was the ladle and the absence of blood in the body. The press quickly caught wind of the details, and the newspapers began to refer to the unknown assailant as the Atlas Vampire. It is rare that order and violence coexist so perfectly, creating a stillness that is more aggressive than any chaos. I find it difficult to imagine the sequence of events that leads to a person folding their clothes neatly on a chair before being subjected to such an act. It suggests a level of trust or a sudden, overwhelming violence that left no room for a struggle. The room showed no signs of a fight. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation into the Atlas District murder began to stall. The police had exhausted their list of suspects, and the forensic technology of 1932 could offer no further clues from the saliva or the dried blood on the ladle. The apartment was eventually cleared out, the furniture sold or discarded, and the small room was prepared for a new tenant. The residents of the building continued their lives, but the ground floor window of apartment number 5 was watched with a certain level of apprehension. Mimi moved away shortly after, unable to look at the milk bottles in the hallway without feeling the return of that heavy silence. The order Lily had worked so hard to maintain had been replaced by a mystery that refused to be solved. The case of Lili Lindström became a dark legend in Swedish history. It was a crime that combined the mundane details of a small apartment with a level of ritualistic horror that seemed to belong to another century. The visitor had walked out of a locked room and vanished into the bustling streets of Stockholm, leaving behind nothing but an empty ladle and a body that had been hollowed out. No one was ever charged with the murder. The identity of the visitor who entered the apartment on the night of May 4th remains a void in the police archives. Some speculated it was a person with medical knowledge, while others believed it was someone driven by a rare and dangerous psychological compulsion. Whatever the truth, the person never struck again in the same manner, or perhaps they were never caught. As of 2026, the file on the Atlas Vampire remains open but inactive. Modern forensic teams have attempted to recover DNA from the original evidence, but the ladle had been cleaned for exhibition decades ago, and the other items were lost in the chaotic years of the mid-20th century. The case is studied primarily by students of criminal history as a perfect example of a cold case. The building on Sankt Eriksplan still stands, and the small windows of the ground floor still look out onto the street. The Atlas district has changed, with new shops and modern apartments, but the story of the quiet woman who folded her clothes before the light went out is still part of the local lore. The silence of that room in 1932 is a reminder of the secrets that can exist behind a locked door. The memory of Lili Lindström is now tied to a silver utensil and a title given by the press, a far cry from the orderly life she led. The blood that was taken from her was never found, and the person who took it was never seen again. The mystery of the Atlas Vampire is a cold closing beat in the history of the city, a trace of a presence that was as efficient as it was terrifying. The silver ladle remains in a museum cabinet, a physical trace of an act that is as difficult to explain today as it was nearly a century ago. It sits under a glass case, reflecting the soft light of the gallery, a mundane object that once held the most intimate part of a human life. The story of Lili Lindström is a testament to the fact that some absences are louder than any scream. The locked door of that Stockholm apartment suggests a visitor who could move through boundaries as if they weren't there. It is a frightening thought. The idea of an intruder who leaves the room exactly as they found it, except for the life they took. This same feeling of an impossible disappearance in a confined space follows us to the tunnels of the Paris Métro, where a woman was lost in 90 seconds. In 1937, the transit system of Paris was a place of constant movement and predictable schedules. People entered and exited the cars with a mechanical precision, their lives intersecting for only a few moments between stations. But in the space between two stops, a young woman would encounter a shadow that left no trace and no explanation for how it arrived at its destination. Paris, the 16th of May, 1937. The city was breathing softly under the weight of a warm Sunday evening. Laetitia Toureau walked toward the entrance of the Porte de Charenton Métro station, her silhouette blending into the long shadows of the late afternoon. The air carried a hint of rain and the dusty scent of stone that had been baked by the sun all day. She was 29 years old, a woman who moved through the world with a quiet, practiced efficiency. To the people in her neighborhood, she was a hard-working widow who spent her days at a glue factory on the outskirts of the city. Her hands were often stained with the residues of her labor, and her clothes were simple, durable, and always neatly maintained. Her apartment was a small, functional space that reflected the austerity of her life. She kept a few books on a wooden shelf and a single photograph of her late husband on the bedside table. Every morning, she followed the same mechanical routine. The sound of the kettle, the clicking of the door lock, and the rhythmic walk toward the train that would take her to the factory. At the factory, the air was thick with the sharp, chemical smell of adhesives and the constant roar of machinery. Laetitia worked alongside dozens of other women, her eyes fixed on the assembly line as she performed her tasks with a precision that bordered on the hypnotic. She rarely spoke to her colleagues, preferring the company of her own thoughts and the steady pulse of the work. However, when the sun went down and the factory gates closed, a different version of Laetitia would emerge. She would return to her apartment, wash the chemical scent from her skin, and dress in clothes that were far more elegant than her daytime attire. She frequented the dance halls and bistros of the city, moving through the crowds with a social grace that seemed entirely out of place. She often visited a place called the Petit Jardin, a lively dance hall where the music was loud and the lights were low. There, she was known by several different names, and she seemed to have a wide circle of acquaintances who moved in the fringes of the city's social life. She was a woman who knew how to listen, her gaze steady and observant as people spoke around her. On this specific Sunday, Laetitia had spent the afternoon visiting her brother. They had talked about the weather and the upcoming holidays, the conversation staying on the surface of their lives. As she prepared to leave, she checked her small leather handbag, ensuring her keys and her ticket were in place. She offered a polite smile and stepped out into the cooling air of the evening. The station at Porte de Charenton was relatively quiet as she descended the stone steps. The platform was a long, tiled tunnel that hummed with the distant vibration of approaching trains. A few other passengers were scattered along the benches, their faces illuminated by the dim, yellow lights of the overhead fixtures. Laetitia stood near the edge of the platform, her hands folded. The train pulled into the station at exactly 6:27 in the evening. It was a green and white carriage, the metal screeching against the rails as it came to a halt. Laetitia stepped toward the first-class section, a car that was almost always empty on a Sunday night. She reached for the heavy brass handle of the door and pulled it open, the interior appearing still. The car was a space of polished wood and plush upholstery, lit by small lamps that cast a soft glow across the empty seats. As she stepped inside, the heavy door clicked shut behind her, sealing her inside the quiet environment. "I am alone," she thought, her eyes scanning the rows of seats before she chose a place near the middle of the carriage and sat down. The train began to move, the floor vibrating beneath her feet as it accelerated into the dark tunnel. The journey to the next station, Porte Doré, was short, a mere 900 meters of track. The lights of the tunnel flickered past the windows in a rapid, staccato rhythm, creating a sense of movement that felt disconnected from the silence inside the car. The physical pressure of the train's speed pushed against the glass, and the air inside the carriage remained thick and undisturbed. You can feel the steady, heavy thrum of the wheels against the steel rails as the darkness of the tunnel presses against the windows, making the interior of the first-class car feel like a small, private world moving through the deep earth. 90 seconds passed. The brakes began to groan as the train slowed for the next stop. The lights of the Porte Doré platform appeared, initially as a blur and then as a sharp, tiled reality. The train came to a smooth halt, and the doors remained closed for a moment before the mechanical latch was released. A few passengers stood waiting on the platform. As the doors opened, a group of people stepped into the first-class carriage. They expected to find a quiet, empty space, but instead, they saw a woman slumped forward in her seat. Her head was bowed, and her hands were resting in her lap. At first, they thought she had simply fallen asleep, her body swaying slightly with the final vibration of the train. One passenger moved closer to offer assistance, reaching out a hand toward her shoulder. As he did, he noticed a dark, spreading stain on the front of her light-colored coat. His gaze moved upward to her neck, where the handle of a knife was protruding. The blade had been driven deep into her throat with a single, professional strike that had severed her carotid artery. There was no one else in the car. The witnesses looked toward the windows and the other doors, but everything was secured. The killer had seemingly vanished into the thin air of the 90-second journey. The station was immediately cordoned off by the police, and the train was held at the platform as the investigators began their reconstruction of the scene. Inspector Chenevier arrived within the hour, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the interior of the carriage. He noted the position of the body and the lack of any sign of a struggle. There were no scuff marks on the floor and no torn fabric. The strike had been so precise and so fast that Leticia had likely not even had time to realize she was in danger. The weapon was a long, thin dagger with a 20-centimeter blade, the kind of tool designed for a very specific and lethal purpose. It was not a common kitchen knife or a tool of a laborer. The police searched the tracks and the tunnel between the two stations, looking for anyone who might have jumped from the moving train, but they found nothing but dust and gravel. The investigation soon let mur the layers of the victim's life. They found that the quiet factory worker was actually an informant for the police, tasked with monitoring the activities of the city's underground political groups. She had been living a double life for years, using her daytime job as a cover for her nightly excursions into the dance halls of Paris. It is a rare thing for a crowded city to become a private tomb in less than 2 minutes. The detectives discovered that Leticia had been in contact with a violent paramilitary organization known as La Cagoule. This group was notorious for its anti-government sentiments and its use of extreme violence to achieve its goals. She had been tasked with infiltrating their inner circle. The police searched her apartment and found a hidden compartment containing coded notes and lists of names. These documents suggested that she had gathered significant intelligence on the group's leadership and their upcoming operations. It became clear that her death was not a random act of violence, but a calculated assassination carried out by a professional. The impossible nature of the crime, the killer's disappearance from a moving train, began to yield to a more grounded theory. Investigators believed the assailant had been hiding in the car before she entered, or had moved between the carriages using the external footboards while the train was in motion. This would require immense skill and a total lack of fear. Despite the discovery of her secret life, the investigation hit a wall of silence. No one in the dance halls remembered seeing a stranger following her that night, and no member of the paramilitary group could be linked to the specific weapon used. The political climate of France was becoming increasingly unstable, and the authorities were hesitant to press the inquiry too hard. The shadow of the coming war began to fall over the case. As the months turned into years, the files on the Métro murder were moved to the back of the archives. The individuals who might have known the truth were scattered by the conflict, and the professional nature of the hit ensured that no physical traces were ever left behind to be discovered by later teams. The knife itself remained in the evidence locker for a time, its long blade a silent witness to the 90 seconds in the tunnel. Eventually, it too was lost in the chaos of the occupation and the liberation of the city. The story of Leticia Toureau became a ghost story of the Paris transit system, a mystery that defied the logical constraints of time and space. No one was ever arrested for the crime. The identity of the presence that entered the car and ended her life remains a blank space in the history of the Métro. It was a crime that relied on the mechanical predictability of the train schedule and the social invisibility of a woman who was technically two people at once. The silence of the carriage was absolute. The case status remains unsolved as we move through the year 2026. Historians and true crime researchers have recently digitized the original police interviews, hoping that modern data analysis might reveal a pattern that Inspector Chenevier missed. Some believe the killer was a high-ranking official within the police force itself, protecting the group. The Porte d'Oreille station still looks much as it did on that Sunday in 1937, with its white tiles and its arched ceiling. Thousands of people pass through the same platform every day, their lives intersecting for a few moments before they move on. They are unaware that the floor beneath their feet once held the weight of a secret that evaporated in the dark. The disappearance of the assailant in the 90 seconds between stations is a reminder that the most crowded places can be the most isolated. Laetitia Toureau lived in a world of whispers and hidden documents, only to be silenced in a space that was supposed to be public. Her story is a cold closing beat in the history of Paris, a trace of an invisible hand. The precision of that strike, and the way the shadow moved through a locked environment, suggests a mind that viewed human life as a series of technical obstacles. It is a frightening level of competence, one that we see again in a very different setting. We leave the tunnels of Paris and travel to the ancient, dusty streets of Beijing under a cold January moon. In 1937, a young girl would leave her ordinary life for a moment and encounter a darkness that was both professional and ritualistic. The silence that followed her disappearance would be filled not by answers, but by the weight of a father's grief and the indifference of a city on the brink of war. The next story begins with a bicycle on a frozen road. Beijing was a city of ancient dust and sharpening winter winds on the evening of January 8, 1937. The sun had already dipped behind the gray brick walls of the legation quarter, leaving the air brittle and thin. 19-year-old Pamela Werner adjusted the thick wool scarf around her neck as she prepared to leave the French legation ice rink. The light was fading fast, turning the city into a collection of long, dark shapes. She moved with a quiet, youthful energy that seemed to push back against the oppressive cold. Her skates were slung over her shoulder, the metal blades clinking softly against each other with every step she took toward the gate. Pamela was a girl of routine and simple pleasures, and the late afternoon skating session was the highlight of her day. She walked toward her bicycle, which stood leaning against a stone pillar near the entrance of the ice rink. The city was in a state of uneasy tension, positioned between its imperial past and an uncertain, militarized future. Beyond the guarded walls of the legation quarter, the streets of Beijing were a labyrinth of narrow alleys known as hutongs. Pamela lived in a comfortable, book-filled home with her father, Edward Theodore Chalmers Werner, a retired British consul and a scholar of Chinese history. Their house was a place of quiet study and deeply ordered daily life. Edward was a man of precise habits, a widower who had focused his remaining years on his daughter and his research. He expected her home by 7:30 for their evening meal, a tradition they rarely broke. The sound of the front door latch clicking into place was the signal that their shared world was intact for another night. He would sit in his study, surrounded by old manuscripts, waiting for the sound of her bicycle tires on the gravel path outside. Pamela climbed onto her bicycle and began the ride home through the darkening streets. The tires crunched over the patches of frozen mud and light snow that dusted the roads. She pedaled past the gates of the foreign compounds, where Chinese sentries stood stiffly in their heavy wool coats. The light from the street lamps was dim, casting long, wavering shadows across the brickwork. She felt the biting wind against her cheeks as she moved toward the city wall. You can feel the vibration of the uneven road, traveling up through the handlebars, and the way the cold air stings the back of your throat with every breath. The silence of the city at twilight is a heavy, physical thing, broken only by the distant chime of a bell or the occasional call of a street vendor. The world feels small and enclosed, as if the darkness is pressing inward from the ancient city walls, narrowing the path ahead to a single, dim line of light. She reached the area near the Fox Tower, a massive stone structure that stood as a sentinel on the southeastern corner of the city's inner wall. The tower was a place of local legend, said to be haunted by spirits that took the form of foxes. To Pamela, it was simply a landmark on her route, a familiar pile of masonry that signaled she was nearly home. She pedaled into the lengthening shadows of the wall, the massive stones towering over her as she moved along. At 7:30, Edward Werner sat in his study, listening for the sound of the gate. He was a man who lived by the clock, his life measured in the turning of pages and the rhythmic ticking of the pendulum. When the hour passed without the sound of her arrival, he did not immediately worry. He assumed she had been delayed by a friend or had stopped to watch the skaters for a few moments longer. He turned a page in his book, the paper dry and crisp in his fingers. By 8 o'clock, the silence of the house began to feel heavier. He walked to the window and looked out at the street, but the road was empty and dark. The wind had picked up, rattling the window frames in their casings and whistling through the gaps in the door. He returned to his desk, but his focus was gone. The scholarly text before him seemed like a collection of meaningless marks on a page. He checked his pocket watch once more, the gold lid clicking shut. At 9 o'clock, Edward put on his heavy coat and hat. He walked to the skating rink, his footsteps echoing in the empty streets. The ice was dark and deserted, the lanterns having been extinguished for the night. He asked the watchman if he had seen a young woman on a bicycle, but the man only shook his head. The worry in Edward's chest began to tighten, a cold, sharp knot that he could not wish away as he turned to look back at the dark road toward the tower. He spent the rest of the night roaming the streets of the legation quarter and the nearby hutongs. He called out her name into the dark, his voice sounding thin and fragile against the vastness of the city. He contacted the local police, both the British and the Chinese authorities, but they had no reports of accidents or disturbances. The morning light began to bleed into the sky, gray and indifferent, as he returned home alone to wait by the silent telephone. Just after dawn, a local man walking near the base of the Fox Tower noticed a shape in the drainage ditch. He stopped and peered down, his breath clouding in the freezing air. At first, he thought it was a discarded bundle of clothing or a pile of refuse left by travelers. As the light grew stronger, he saw the pale curve of a shoulder and the tangled strands of dark hair. He did not move closer. He turned and ran toward the nearest sentry, his heart pounding. The police arrived within the hour, led by Chief Inspector Richard Dennis of the British Legation Police. He found the body of Pamela Werner lying at the foot of the tower. Her bicycle was nowhere to be found. The scene was one of extreme, calculated violence that stood in stark contrast to the quiet, ancient stone above it. Dennis noted the lack of blood on the ground, a detail that suggested she had been killed elsewhere and moved to the site under the cover of night. The physical state of the victim was a source of immediate horror for the investigators. Her skull had been fractured by several heavy blows, and her face had been severely beaten. But the most disturbing discovery was the condition of her torso. Her clothing had been torn open, and a long, clean incision had been made from her throat to her abdomen. Her heart and several other internal organs had been surgically removed with a level of skill that was deeply unsettling. There was a clinical, almost ritualistic quality to the mutilations that suggested the killer possessed a high degree of anatomical knowledge. The cuts were not the work of a panicked attacker or a common street predator. They were the work of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for and how to extract it. Dennis stood in the cold morning light, looking at the tower, and felt a profound sense of unease as he realized the sophistication of the perpetrator. This was not a crime of passion. It was an operation, Dennis thought as he directed his men to secure the area. The absence of the heart was a detail that defied easy explanation. It suggested a motive that went beyond mere murder, pointing towards something much darker and more secretive. He knew that investigating a crime of this nature in a city on the brink of war would be an almost impossible task, yet he felt a grim determination to find the answer. The investigation became a complex struggle between the British authorities and the Chinese police. Both sides were suspicious of the other, and the political tensions between the foreign powers and the rising Japanese influence made every step a potential diplomatic incident. Dennis worked alongside Colonel Han of the Chinese police, but the two men found it difficult to share information in such a fractured environment. The city was a place where no one was fully trusted. They began by canvassing the Badlands, a notorious district of bars, brothels, and gambling dens that sat just outside the legation quarter. It was a place where the city's foreign expatriates often mixed with the local underworld. The police believed that someone in the district must have seen something on the night of the 8th. They interviewed bartenders and dancers, but the inhabitants were experts at staying silent when the authorities came knocking on their doors. Edward Werner, dissatisfied with the pace of the official inquiry, began his own private investigation. He used his personal savings to hire informers and spent his days tracking down every lead, no matter how small. He became a familiar, haunting figure in the city, his face drawn and his eyes filled with a desperate, singular focus. He was no longer a scholar of history. He was a man trying to find the author of his daughter's end in a world that seemed to be forgetting her. He focused his attention on a group of expatriates who were known for their eccentric and often hedonistic lifestyles. These individuals, many of them wealthy and influential, lived in large homes and hosted private parties that were shielded from public view. Edward began to hear rumors of a secret group that practiced nudism and performed strange rituals in the hills outside the city. He believed these men held the key to the mystery at the base of the stone tower. Among the suspects was a prominent American dentist and a former medical officer who were frequently seen together in the Badlands. These men possessed the surgical skills required for the mutilations found on Pamela's body. They were part of a social circle that prided itself on its total disregard for the laws and social norms of the legations. They lived in a world of absolute privilege, where the consequences of their actions were hidden by their status and wealth. Edward discovered that several of these men had been at a party on the night of the murder, located in a house not far from where Pamela had been skating. He found a witness who claimed to have seen a young woman being led into the house, and another who heard a muffled scream coming from the garden. But when he brought this information to the police, he was told that the individuals involved were too well connected to be questioned or brought into a station. I have seen many fathers broken by grief, but there is a specific kind of coldness that settles over a man when he realizes that the killers of his child are protected by the very system he once served. Edward Werner did not stop his search. Even as the official investigation was quietly shelved, he continued to gather evidence, documenting the movements of the suspects and the failures of the authorities to act on his findings, building a case that no one would hear. The mystery of the Fox Tower became a symbol of the decay and corruption within the foreign community in Beijing. The idea that a young girl could be taken from the street and subjected to such a professional, clinical horror was a reminder of the darkness that could exist behind the facade of colonial order. The case was a physical trace of a world that was falling apart, where the rules of civilization no longer applied and the innocent were left to the shadows. In July of 1937, the political tensions finally boiled over into open conflict. The Japanese military launched a full-scale invasion of China, and Beijing was quickly occupied. The British and Chinese police were forced to abandon their work as the city became a battlefield. The case files for the murder of Pamela Werner were packed into crates or simply left behind in the chaos of the retreat. The official memory of the crime began to dissolve in the smoke. Edward Werner refused to leave his home. He remained in the occupied city, continuing his research and his private hunt for the killers. He lived through the hunger and the fear of the occupation, his mind fixed on the image of his daughter and the Fox Tower. He wrote long, detailed letters to the British government, demanding that the suspects be brought to justice. But his pleas were ignored in the larger struggle of the World War that was consuming the entire planet. The primary suspects eventually left China, moving to other parts of the world where their pasts could not follow them. They took their secrets and their surgical skills with them, leaving behind a grieving father and an unsolved crime. The occupation of Beijing erased many of the physical traces of the events of 1937, and the shifting borders of the post-war world made any further investigation nearly impossible for the authorities who remained. Edward Werner died in 1954, still clutching the files he had gathered over 17 years of searching. He never saw a courtroom or a confession. His death was the final closing beat of the story, leaving the mystery of the Fox Tower without its most dedicated hunter. The scholarly world remembered him for his contributions to Chinese history, but the streets of Beijing remembered him as the man who searched the dark for a ghost that never spoke. The truth of what happened on the night of January 8th remains hidden in the archives of a vanished era, The evidence gathered by Edward points toward a group of men who viewed the city as their playground and the people in it as objects for their darker impulses. They operated with a level of professional detachment that allowed them to commit a ritualistic horror and then return to their ordinary lives as if nothing had ever changed in the world around them. The case status is officially unsolved as we move through the year 2026. In recent years, historians have used digital mapping and newly discovered personal diaries from the expatriate community to reconstruct the social networks of 1937. These researchers have identified a specific house in the Badlands that matches Edward Werner's descriptions, providing a grounded location for the events he suspected occurred on that winter night. Fox Tower still stands on the corner of the old city wall, though the moat and the drainage ditches have long since been filled. It is now a museum, surrounded by a park where people fly kites and walk their dogs in the spring air. The legend of the fox spirits continues to be told to visitors, but the true horror that occurred at its base is a story that is mostly forgotten by the modern city that has grown up around the ancient, silent stone of the fortress. The surgical precision of the act at Fox Tower suggests a mind that could separate the physical body from the human spirit with the flick of a wrist. It is a terrifying level of control, one that we see mirrored in the kitchen of a small house in Italy. There, a woman prepared meals and folded laundry, all while managing a collection of shadows that she believed would protect her family from the darkness of a coming war through the power of a horrific sacrifice. The town of Correggio, Italy, was a place where the stones of the buildings seemed to absorb the heat of the afternoon sun, releasing it slowly into the evening air. In the late 1930s, the streets were narrow and paved with cobblestones that had been smoothed by generations of footsteps. It was a community built on the shared rhythms of the market, the church, and the local shops that lined the main thoroughfares of the district. The air carried the scent of roasting coffee and the dry, earthy smell of the surrounding plains of the Emilia-Romagna region. It is a strange feature of human nature that we often mistake extreme devotion for a sign of total safety, assuming that a person who cares deeply for their own must be incapable of harm toward others. Leonarda Cianciulli was a woman who occupied a very specific and respected place within this social fabric. She ran a small, cluttered shop that sold soap, candles, and various household necessities. Her customers knew her as a woman of small stature but immense energy, someone who always had a pot of coffee ready for a neighbor who needed a moment of rest. Her shop was a sanctuary of domesticity, with shelves stacked high with folded linens and jars of preserves that caught the afternoon light. Leonarda moved through the space with a practiced efficiency, her hands always busy with some task or another. She was known for her hospitality, often inviting local women into the small kitchen at the back of the building for a chat. To the people of Correggio, she was a symbol of the resilient, maternal spirit that kept the community together during difficult and uncertain times. The atmosphere of the 1930s was increasingly defined by the distant but persistent rumble of political instability. The news from the radio and the papers spoke of mobilization and the gathering clouds of a Second World War. Leonarda, like many mothers in the town, watched her eldest son Giuseppe with a sense of growing apprehension. He was her favorite, the child upon whom she had pinned all her hopes for the future, and the prospect of him being called to the front was a constant weight on her mind. Leonarda's devotion to her children was rooted in a history of profound and repeated loss. She had been pregnant 17 times in her life, but only 4 of those children had survived into adulthood. The others had been taken by miscarriages or childhood illnesses, leaving behind a series of empty cradles and a deep, gnawing fear in her heart. She viewed the world as a place of constant threat, where a mother had to be eternally vigilant to protect the few treasures she had left from being taken away. This fear was amplified by a prophecy she had received from a fortune teller years earlier. The woman had told Leonarda that all of her children would die young, and that she herself was destined for a life that ended in prison and a criminal asylum. Leonarda had spent decades trying to outrun this prediction, turning towards superstition and folk magic to find a way to shield her family. She believed that the safety of her son required a balance of life and death that only she could maintain through sacrifice. As the mobilization of the Italian army intensified in 1939, Leonarda's anxiety reached a breaking point. She became convinced that the only way to save Giuseppe from the carnage of the war was to provide the universe with alternative lives. She began to view her neighbors not as friends, but as potential offerings. She moved through her daily routines in the shop and the kitchen with a new, secret purpose, her mind constantly calculating the weights and measures of a dark and ancient exchange. Her first target was a middle-aged woman named Faustina Setti. Faustina was a lonely soul, a spinster who had spent her life longing for a husband and a home of her own. She was a frequent visitor to Leonarda's kitchen, where she would sit and listen to the shopkeeper's stories with a look of quiet envy. Leonarda noticed this longing and began to weave a narrative for her friend, telling her about a wonderful man she knew in the town of Pola who was looking for a wife just like Faustina. Leonarda told Faustina that the man was wealthy and kind and that he had seen a photograph of her and was eager to meet. She convinced the woman to keep the arrangement a total secret, explaining that any interference from family or neighbors might ruin the delicate courtship. Faustina, blinded by the hope of a new life, agreed to everything. She began to pack her bags and sell her few belongings, bringing the proceeds to Leonarda for safekeeping during the long journey to the coast of Italy. On the day of her departure, Faustina arrived at the shop for one final cup of coffee. She was dressed in her best coat, her face bright with an excitement she had not felt in years. Leonarda led her into the back kitchen, where the air was thick with the smell of brewing espresso and the faint, sweet scent of almond biscuits. Faustina sat at the small wooden table, her hands trembling slightly as she held the delicate ceramic cup. She spoke of her future in Pola, unaware of the heavy tool resting nearby. "My son will be safe now," Leonarda thought, as the weight of the copper pot felt light in her hands. She stood behind her friend, her movements silent and fluid. The transition from the ordinary hospitality of a shopkeeper to the execution of a ritual was instantaneous. There was no struggle and no sound that reached the street outside. The silence of the kitchen remained intact as Leonarda began the long and technical process of fulfilling her side of the bargain she believed she had made with the universe. She moved with a clinical detachment, treating the physical remains as raw material for her craft. She used the same tools she employed for her household chores, working with a precision that was both domestic and horrifying. The blood was carefully collected and set aside to dry in the cool air of the pantry. The rest was placed in a large, heavy pot along with 7 kilograms of caustic soda, which she had taken from the shelves of her own shop. She stirred the mixture until it dissolved. You can smell the thick, cloying steam rising from the heavy copper pot in the kitchen, a scent that is both sweet and metallic, clinging to the curtains and the wool of your sweater. The process took hours of constant attention, with Leonarda adjusting the flame of the stove to ensure the correct consistency. She was a master of her environment, moving between the boiling pot and the kitchen table where she prepared the next stage of her work. The mundane reality of the house continued around her. Once the mixture had thickened and cooled, Leonarda poured it into wooden molds to set. She added lavender and rose oil to mask the heavy, alkaline scent of the caustic soda. These blocks would eventually become bars of soap, which she would distribute to her friends and neighbors as gifts. She took the dried blood from the pantry and ground it into a fine, dark powder. This she mixed with flour, sugar, eggs, and chocolate, baking a batch of crunchy tea cakes that she served to visitors. The second victim was Francesca Soavi, a local teacher who had been promised a lucrative position at a girls' school in Piacenza. Like Faustina before her, Francesca was instructed to write letters to her relatives in advance, telling them she had already arrived and was doing well, to be mailed later. She brought her savings to Leonarda to be handled through a bank in the new city. In the autumn of 1940, she followed the same path into the back kitchen, where the coffee was hot. Leonarda repeated the process with a practiced ease, the rhythm of the kitchen now entirely defined by the demands of her sacrifices. The soap from the second victim was just as firm as the first, and the tea cakes were just as popular with the people who stopped by the shop for a chat. Leonarda watched her neighbors eat the biscuits, her expression one of maternal pride. She believed that with every life she processed, the invisible shield around Giuseppe grew stronger and more certain. The final victim was Virginia Cacioppo, a woman who had once been a professional opera singer. She was a woman of elegance and grace, though her career had long since faded into a series of quiet memories. Leonarda promised her a job as a secretary for a mysterious impresario in Florence, a position that would allow her to move back into the world of the arts. Virginia was the most enthusiastic of the three, her voice filled with a melodic joy as she discussed her plans with the shopkeeper. On the morning of September 30th, 1940, Virginia entered the back of the shop for the last time. Leonarda noted that the soap produced from this third sacrifice was of a particularly high quality, possessing a creamier texture and a whiter color than the previous batches. She told the police later that the woman's flesh was particularly suited for the process. She baked a new set of cakes and shared them with the women of Correggio, who commented on how light and sweet they were. The disappearance of 3 prominent women in a small town eventually began to draw the attention of the local authorities. While Faustina and Francesca had few close relatives, Virginia Cacioppo's sister-in-law was a woman of sharp intuition and persistent curiosity. She had seen Virginia entering Leonarda's shop on the morning she vanished and noted that she had never been seen leaving. She grew suspicious of the shopkeeper's sudden generosity and the strange, persistent smell of chemicals. The sister-in-law contacted the superintendent of police in Reggio Emilia, who launched a formal investigation into the disappearances. The detectives began by questioning Leonarda, who initially maintained a calm and helpful demeanor. She spoke of her friends with a look of genuine sadness, claiming they had all left for their new lives, just as they had planned. However, when the police searched her home, they found the letters the women had written but never mailed, hidden in a drawer. The discovery of the letters and the personal belongings of the missing women led to Leonarda's immediate arrest. Under the pressure of the interrogation, her maternal facade finally shattered. She did not express remorse or fear. Instead, she provided a detailed and technical account of her crimes. She explained her motives with a terrifying sincerity, insisting that she had acted only to save her son from the war. She spoke of the soap and the cakes as if they were mundane household achievements. The trial of Leonarda Cianciulli became a sensation across Italy, drawing crowds of people who were both fascinated and repulsed by the soap maker of Correggio. She was a defiant figure in the courtroom, at one point offering to demonstrate her process for the judges to prove how efficient she had been. The prosecutors struggled to map her maternal devotion onto the brutal reality of her actions. She was eventually found guilty of 3 counts of murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Consistent with the prophecy she had believed in for so long, Leonarda spent the final years of her life in a criminal asylum in Pozzuoli. She continued to write and knit, her hands never staying still. She died in 1970, having outlived the war and the son she had tried so hard to protect through the most intimate form of violence. The tools she used in her kitchen were taken by the authorities and placed in the Criminological Museum in Rome, where they remain to this day. The heavy copper pot and the white ceramic cups are displayed behind glass, the metal dulled by the passage of decades but still holding the weight of their history. Visitors to the museum stand in silence before the collection of domestic objects, trying to reconcile the image of a cozy kitchen with the reality of the cauldron. The town of Correggio has moved on, its cobblestones now covered by asphalt and its narrow streets filled with the sounds of modern life and the hum of traffic. As of 2026, the case of Leonarda Cianciulli is still frequently cited in studies of the psychology of superstition and maternal obsession. The house where the crimes occurred still stands, though it has been renovated many times over the years. The shop is gone, replaced by a modern storefront, but the elderly residents of the town still remember the stories their grandmothers told them about the neighbor who made the best tea cakes in the entire Emilia-Romagna region. The maternal instinct is often viewed as a purely creative force, but in the hands of the shopkeeper, it became a tool of total destruction. She believed she was balancing a celestial ledger but she was only creating a cycle of absence that could never be filled. The silence that followed the disappearances in Correggio was not the peace of a sacrifice accepted, but the cold realization that the people we trust the most are often the ones who know exactly how to pull us into the dark. The blocks of soap eventually dissolved, and the cakes were eaten, leaving behind nothing but a collection of empty rooms and the persistent questions of the families left behind. The memory of the three women is now tied to the technical details of their end, a physical trace that is as enduring as the copper pot in the museum. The story of the soap maker is a cold closing beat in the history of the town, a reminder that the most dangerous shadows are often the ones that look like home. The packaging of a crime within the mundane objects of a household is a specific kind of horror, one that relies on the invisibility of the act until the container is opened. It is the same feeling of a hidden truth waiting to be revealed that we find in the ports of South America. There, a heavy wooden trunk was loaded onto a ship, its contents hidden by the labels of a journey that was never meant to reach its destination. We move now from the kitchens of Italy to the salt air of the Brazilian coast. The port of Santos in Brazil was a place of heavy, humid heat and the constant rhythmic labor of empire on the morning of October 7, 1928. The air was a thick mixture of sea salt, roasted coffee beans, and the dark, sulfurous scent of low tide. Thousands of wooden crates and iron-bound trunks moved across the docks daily, hauled by cranes and the strained muscles of laborers who spoke a dozen different languages. Amidst this mechanical chaos, the steamship Massilia sat low in the water, its black hull reflecting the harsh South American sun. It was a vessel of transition, carrying people and cargo between the ports of the Atlantic. The deck was a crowded landscape of passengers leaning over the rails and dock workers securing the last of the shipments. In this environment, a single object rarely drew any individual attention from the busy customs officials. Among the cargo waiting to be hoisted into the hold was a particularly large and heavy wooden trunk. It was a sturdy thing, bound with metal straps and addressed to a destination in Bordeaux, France. The shipping manifest listed it as containing personal effects and household goods. To any casual observer, it was merely another piece of luggage belonging to someone moving across the world to start a new life in the European autumn. The trunk had been delivered to the port by a man who appeared to be in a great hurry. He was an Italian immigrant who had arrived in Brazil only a few months earlier, seeking the prosperity that the coffee boom promised to many Europeans at the time. He moved with a nervous, jerky energy, his eyes darting toward the ship as he finalized the paperwork with the shipping agent. He paid the fees in cash and left the docks without looking back. Only a year before, this same man had been living in Buenos Aires, Argentina, where he had met a young woman named Maria Mercedes Fea. Maria was 22 years old, with a bright, trusting face and a family that adored her. She saw in the man a chance for adventure and stability. He presented himself as a successful businessman with deep connections in the trade industry, a man who could provide her with a life of comfort and social standing. Their courtship was swift, fueled by the man's grand promises of a future in Sao Paulo, which was then the fastest-growing city in South America. Maria's parents were hesitant, as they knew very little about the man's background, but Maria was convinced she had found her partner. They were married in a small ceremony, and shortly after, they boarded a train for the long journey across the border into the heart of Brazil. When they arrived in Sao Paulo, the reality of their situation began to shift away from the man's descriptions. Instead of a grand estate or a luxury apartment, he led Maria to a modest, cramped room in a boarding house. He explained that his assets were temporarily tied up in a foreign bank and that they simply needed to be patient. Maria accepted this with a quiet grace, spending her days arranging their few belongings to make the space feel like a home. The weeks turned into months, and the promised wealth never materialized. The man would leave every morning, claiming to be meeting with investors or checking on his shipments at the port, but he always returned empty-handed and increasingly irritable. Maria began to notice small discrepancies in his stories. He would forget the names of the people he supposedly worked with, or he would become defensive when she asked simple questions about their finances. The atmosphere in the small room became one of mounting pressure. Maria was now several months pregnant, and the physical reality of their poverty was becoming impossible to ignore. She spent long hours alone, listening to the sounds of the city outside and the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall. I should have listened to my mother, she thought. The realization of her isolation sinking in as she looked at the dwindling pile of coins in her purse. She eventually discovered a hidden stash of pawn tickets in one of her husband's coat pockets. They were for her own jewelry pieces her parents had given her as wedding gifts. The man had been systematically selling her history to pay for their daily bread. When she confronted him, the mask of the successful businessman finally dissolved, revealing a desperate, failing man who had built his entire identity on a foundation of elaborate and fragile lies. A series of intense arguments followed, fueled by the man's shame and Maria's growing fear for her unborn child. He began to talk about leaving Brazil and moving to France, where he claimed to have a brother who could help them. He insisted that they needed to ship their heavy items ahead of them to save on the passenger fare. He purchased a large wooden trunk and brought it into their room, where it sat in the corner like a silent wooden coffin. On the morning of the shipment, the man appeared at the port alone. He told the agent that his wife had already traveled ahead to visit relatives and would meet him in France. He watched as the laborers loaded the trunk onto a cart, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He seemed relieved to be rid of the weight, unaware that the physical laws of the world were about to conspire against the secrecy he had worked so hard to maintain. As the crane began to lift the wooden trunk toward the hold of the Massilia, a mechanical failure occurred. A cable slipped, or perhaps the weight was improperly balanced, and the trunk tilted sharply in midair. It slammed against the side of the ship with a sickening, hollow thud before falling back onto the concrete of the dock. The impact was violent, the heavy wood splintering and the metal straps groaning under the sudden, massive internal pressure. The trunk did not shatter, but a large crack appeared along the base. Almost immediately, a dark, viscous liquid began to seep through the splintered wood, pooling on the gray concrete. A foul, overpowering scent of decay erupted into the humid air, cutting through the smell of coffee and salt. The dock workers stopped their labor, their eyes fixed on the trunk. You can feel the sudden, prickling silence of the crowd as the heat of the sun intensifies the stench. A customs official named Onofre stepped forward, his face pale as he looked at the dark stains spreading toward his boots. He called for a crowbar, his voice tight with a professional apprehension. The laborers gathered in a tight circle, their earlier chatter replaced by a heavy, expectant dread. Onofre placed the edge of the iron tool into the crack and heaved upward, the sound of the wood screaming as the nails were pulled from their settings. When the lid was finally pried away, the men staggered back, some of them covering their mouths. Inside the trunk, they found the body of a young woman, folded and compressed into the small space with a brutal, mechanical efficiency. Her limbs had been bound with heavy wire, and her neck showed the clear, dark marks of a thin cable. She was dressed in a simple floral gown, her eyes closed as if she were merely sleeping in a very small room. The police were summoned to the docks, led by a detective who recognized the technical skill required to fit a human body into such a confined space. They recovered a shipping manifest that listed the sender's address in Sao Paulo. The name on the document was Giuseppe Pistone. The investigators also found a small gold medallion tucked into the woman's clothing, which bore the initials of Maria Mercedes Fea. The truth of the trunk was beginning to emerge. The detective traveled to the boarding house in Sao Paulo, where he found the room empty. The neighbors described a man who had left in a state of high agitation only hours before. They mentioned that his wife had not been seen for several days. Inside the room, the police found remnants of the wire used to bind the body and a small, blood-stained patch on the floorboards that had been unsuccessfully scrubbed with lye and a stiff-bristled brush. A city-wide manhunt for Giuseppe Pistone was launched. The authorities checked every boarding house, every train station, and every outbound ship. They knew he could not have gone far, as he had very little money and no remaining connections in the city. The image of the trunk killer was printed on the front page of every newspaper, his face becoming a symbol of the ultimate betrayal of the domestic trust that held the immigrant community together. The police finally received a tip from a local merchant who had seen a man matching the description hiding in a small, derelict building near the outskirts of the city. When the officers arrived, they found Giuseppe Pistone sitting in the corner of a dark room, his head in his hands. He did not resist arrest. He appeared exhausted, the weight of his lies and the physical burden of the trunk having finally broken his resolve to remain a free man. During the interrogation, the man initially tried to claim that Maria had died of natural causes and that he had panicked. He argued that he only wanted to return her to her family in Europe, but the medical examiner's report was clear. Maria had been strangled with a wire while she was alive. The marks on her limbs indicated she had been bound with professional precision before the onset of rigor mortis made such a feat of compression impossible. The trial of Giuseppe Pistone was the largest media event in the history of Brazil at that time. The courtroom was packed with people who were both horrified and fascinated by the details of the crime. The prosecution presented the trunk itself as evidence. The splintered wood, a physical trace of the man's attempt to discard his life. The defense tried to argue a crime of passion, but the cold, calculated nature of the shipment pointed toward a different truth. I find it particularly chilling to consider the amount of time the man spent in that small room with the trunk after the act was completed. He had to measure the wood, source the wire, and carefully arrange the body of the woman he had promised to protect. This was not a moment of sudden madness. It was a series of technical steps performed with a total lack of empathy. He treated his wife like the cargo he had always claimed to possess. Giuseppe Pistone was found guilty of the murder of Maria Mercedes Fea and was sentenced to 31 years in the state prison. The case became a permanent part of the cultural landscape of Brazil, often referred to as O Crime da Mala. It served as a grim warning about the dangers of the gold fever that brought so many desperate men to the country, men who were willing to fabricate entire histories to secure a place in a new society. The tragedy of the case was amplified by the discovery that Maria had been writing letters to her mother in Argentina, which she had never sent. In these letters, she spoke of her fears and her realization that her husband was not the man he claimed to be. She had been planning to leave him and return home, but she was waiting until she had saved enough money to pay for the train fare. She was caught between a lie and a hope. The physical trunk was kept in a police museum for decades, its surface dark and scarred by the fall on the docks. It was eventually moved to a forensic archive, where it serves as a teaching tool for investigators. It is a mundane object, a simple container for household goods, that became the final vessel for a young woman's life. The splinters in the wood are the only remaining witnesses to the pressure that was applied from within. As of 2026, the story of Maria Mercedes Fea is still told in the port city of Santos. The docks have been modernized, with massive container ships and computer-guided cranes replacing the wooden crates and steamships of the past. But the legend of the trunk persists, a cold closing beat in the history of the harbor. The site where the trunk fell is now covered by a transit warehouse, a place of constant, unblinking movement. The fate of Giuseppe Pistone is recorded in the prison archives. He served his sentence with a quiet, unremarkable diligence, eventually being released in the 1950s. He vanished into the crowded streets of São Paulo, a man who had outlived his crime, but not the memory of it. He died in obscurity, leaving behind only the cold record of a name that had once been synonymous with a wooden box and a broken promise of wealth. The memory of the girl in the trunk remains a physical trace of the high cost of a lie. Maria's family eventually brought her remains back to Argentina, where she was buried in a quiet cemetery far from the humid air of the Brazilian coast. Her grave is a place of stillness, a contrast to the violent movement of the docks. The silence of her final rest is the only thing that could fill the emptiness created by her sudden and brutal absence. The trunk at the port was a container for a secret that was never meant to be opened, a physical manifestation of a truth that was too heavy to be carried across the ocean. It is the same kind of hidden burden that we find in the quiet, rural spaces of New Zealand. There, a young girl would vanish into the night with a car she could not drive, leaving behind a mystery that would remain as still as the fields of her home. The silence of a farm in the Bay of Plenty is a different kind of quiet than the roar of a busy port. But the weight of a disappearance is the same. In 1928, the same year the trunk fell in Santos, a family in New Zealand would wake to find their world had become smaller by one. The story of Elsie Walker is the final closing beat of our evening, a trace of a presence that was lost between the stars and the grass. The Bay of Plenty, on the North Island of New Zealand, was a place of rolling green hills and deep, silent valleys in October of 1928. The air was cool and held the heavy scent of damp grass and the salt from the distant Pacific. In the rural district of Teikoku, the nights were so quiet that you could hear the shifting of the cattle in the paddocks from half a mile away under the star-filled sky. It was a landscape that felt entirely secure, where the only movement after dark was the wind in the orchards. 17-year-old Elsie Walker lived a life that was measured by the natural cycles of the farm. She was a girl with a gentle temperament, known for her quiet efficiency and her willingness to help with the daily chores. She lived with her aunt and uncle on their isolated property, where her world was defined by the kitchen, the garden, and the long, winding driveway that led to the main road. She moved through her days with a modest, unhurried grace that made her presence feel as steady as the morning light. The farm was a collection of sturdy timber buildings, surrounded by thick hedges and heavy iron gates. It was a place of deep security, where the locks were checked every evening and the rhythms of the day were never broken. Elsie's room was small and tidy, with a window that looked out over the orchards toward the hills. She spent her evenings reading by a single lamp, the light casting a warm, yellow glow across her books. The silence of the house was a comfort, a signal that the day's work was done. On the evening of October 1st, the household followed its usual mechanical pattern. They sat for dinner at the heavy oak table, the clatter of silverware against ceramic bowls the only sound in the room. Elsie mentioned her plans for the next day, her voice calm and even. There was no sign of distress, no flicker of a secret, and no indication that her life was anything other than a series of predictable movements. She sat with her family, a quiet participant in the ordinary life of the Bay of Plenty. After the meal, Elsie helped her aunt clear the dishes, her hands moving through the warm, soapy water with a practiced ease. They spoke of the upcoming harvest and the small things that needed to be done around the house. It was a moment of profound normalcy, the kind of quiet interaction that forms the backbone of a rural life. When she said goodnight and headed toward her room, it was with the expectation of a Tuesday morning just like the one before. The stairs groaned softly under her weight. The uncle, Frank Bailey, performed his final circuit of the property before retiring for the night. He checked the garage, where the family's heavy sedan was parked, and he ensured the massive iron gates at the end of the drive were chained and locked. The security of the farm was his primary responsibility, and he took pride in the fact that nothing ever entered or left his land without his knowledge. He turned out the last lamp, and the house fell into deep shadow, the air growing cold and still. The night passed without any sound that would have alerted the family to a deviation. There was no sound of a struggling engine, no crunch of gravel under heavy tires, and no cry that reached the upstairs windows. The silence of the Bay of Plenty was total, a dark blanket that covered the paddocks and the orchards. The world remained still, the clocks ticking toward a morning that would reveal a sudden and impossible emptiness in the house. A single owl called from the trees, then was silent. At 6 o'clock the next morning, the aunt went to Elsie's room to wake her for the morning chores. She knocked on the wooden door, but there was no response from within. When she pushed the door open, she saw that the bed was neatly made, the linens pulled tight and undisturbed. Elsie was not there. Her clothes were missing from the chair, but her coat and her shoes were still sitting by the door. The room felt cold, as if the air had not been moved for several hours during the dark night. Frank Bailey walked out to the garage, his footsteps quick and heavy on the dew-covered grass of the courtyard. He found the doors to the shed wide open. The family sedan was gone. He looked toward the end of the long driveway, and saw that the heavy iron gates were still closed and the chains were still locked. There was no sign of a forced entry, and no tracks on the grass that suggested a car had been driven over the lawn to bypass the main entrance. The physical reality did not make sense. The family gathered in the kitchen, their faces pale in the early morning light. They knew that Elsie did not know how to drive. She had never even sat behind the steering wheel of the sedan, and she possessed no knowledge of how to operate the heavy, manual gears. The idea that she had taken the car herself was a physical impossibility. Yet, both the girl and the machine were gone, and the gates that stood between the farm and the world remained firmly shut. The absence was absolute. A search of the local area yielded nothing. No one in the neighboring farms had heard a car on the road during the night. The police were notified, but they were as baffled as the family. They searched the orchards and the nearby creeks, fearing an accident or a medical emergency, but the landscape remained indifferent. The disappearance of a girl and a car from a locked property was a puzzle that defied the logical constraints of rural life. The silence of the orchards grew heavier each hour. 3 days later, a report came in from Auckland, a city located over 200 kilometers to the north. A local resident in the suburb of Papatoetoe had noticed a strange car parked in a patch of scrubland near the railway line. When the police arrived, they found the Bailey family sedan. It was covered in dust, but otherwise undamaged. The keys were missing, and the interior of the car was clean. There were no signs of a struggle, and no personal items left behind on the seats or floors. The discovery of the car so far away only deepened the mystery of the night. The journey from the Bay of Plenty to Auckland was a long and difficult drive in 1928, involving winding mountain roads and unpaved tracks. It was a trip that required a skilled driver with a thorough knowledge of the geography. The idea that Elsie had somehow managed this journey alone was discarded immediately. Someone had taken her, or someone had driven her there, hidden in the dark of the car. A massive search was launched in the area around Papatoetoe. Hundreds of volunteers moved through the thick gorse and the swampy ground near the tracks. On the fourth day, a searcher found a small, dark shape in a dense thicket of bushes, only a few hundred yards from where the car had been abandoned. It was Elsie. She was lying on her side, her face resting against the earth. Her clothes were intact, and there was no immediate sign of violence on her body. She looked as if she were sleeping. The medical examiner's report provided no clarity to the investigators. There were no marks of strangulation, no broken bones, and no evidence of a struggle. Toxicological tests showed no signs of poison. The coroner was so perplexed by the lack of physical evidence that he eventually listed the cause of death as heart failure, suggesting that the girl had died from the sheer shock of whatever had occurred. It was a medical verdict that satisfied no one and answered nothing about the drive. The focus of the investigation turned toward the people who had been at the farm on the night of the disappearance. Among the household was a cousin, a young man who had been staying with the family for a few weeks. He was known to have a difficult temperament and a history of erratic behavior. Unlike Elsie, he was a skilled mechanic and an experienced driver who knew the roads between the Bay of Plenty and the city of Auckland intimately. He sat quietly during the initial police questioning. You can feel the tension in the small police station as the detectives watch the cousin across the wooden table, noting the way he avoids their eyes. He claimed he had been asleep in his room all night and had heard nothing. He had no explanation for how the car had left the locked garage, or why he had not noticed the girl's absence until the morning. His calm, almost indifferent demeanor struck the investigators as a sign of a profound detachment. His hands were steady as he lit a cigarette. The police discovered that the cousin had been seen in Auckland on the day the car was found. A witness claimed to have seen a man of his description walking near the railway station, looking disheveled and tired. When confronted with this, the man simply shrugged and denied being in the city. Without a clear cause of death, the police could not prove that a crime had even been committed. They lacked the physical trace that would link the man to the body. The investigation stalled in the mud. An inquest was held in 1929, drawing crowds of people who were eager to see the man they believed was responsible for the girl's end. The cousin sat in the witness box, his face a mask of boredom as the lawyers questioned him about his movements. He provided short, One-word answers, never deviating from his original story. The jury was frustrated by the lack of evidence, and the coroner was forced to return an open verdict. The mystery of the drive remained as dark as before. The man walked out of the courtroom, a free man, though the shadow of the case followed him wherever he went. He moved away from the Bay of Plenty, eventually settling on a different farm in a different part of the country. The family was left with an empty room and a car they no longer wanted to drive. The silence that had settled over the orchards on that October night became a permanent part of their lives, a mystery that refused to yield to time. The gates remained locked, but the trust was gone. For 5 years, the disappearance of Elsie Walker was a cold case, a story told in whispers in the rural districts of New Zealand. The man, whose name was Bill Bailey, lived a quiet life on a farm in Ruawaro, where he worked the land with the same mechanical efficiency he had shown in his youth. His neighbors found him to be a strange and solitary figure, but they had no reason to suspect that the darkness from his past would ever resurface in their community. He was just another farmer in the hills. In 1933, the town of Ruawaro was shaken by a new horror. A neighboring couple, the Lakeys, disappeared from their farm under circumstances that were eerily similar to the events of 1928. Blood was found in their kitchen, but their bodies were missing. The police immediately focused their attention on the solitary neighbor, Bill Bailey. This time, they would not be deterred by a lack of physical evidence or a calm demeanor. They intended to find the physical truth. The search of Bill's property revealed a nightmare hidden in plain sight. Investigators found a large drum that had been used as a furnace. Inside the ash, they discovered fragments of human bone and a set of dentures that belonged to the missing woman. The technical precision of the disposal was chilling. Bill had systematically destroyed the evidence of his crime, believing that without a body, he could never be convicted. He had used his knowledge of the farm to hide a slaughter in the furnace. Bill Bailey was arrested and charged with the double murder of his neighbors. The trial was a national sensation, with the details of the murders filling the front pages of every paper. The prosecution presented the bone fragments and the mechanical details of the furnace as proof of a cold and calculating mind. The jury did not hesitate. Bill was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. The ultimate price for a life defined by secret violence. The shadow of Elsie Walker was finally identified. As he waited for his execution, many wondered if he would finally confess to what had happened to his cousin Elsie in 1928. The police visited him in his cell, hoping for a closure that had been denied for 5 years. But Bill remained silent, his face as unreadable as it had been during the inquest. He took the secret of the long drive to Auckland and the broken heart of the 17-year-old girl to the gallows with him. He died without a word of remorse for his family. The execution took place in July of 1934. With his death, the legal path to the truth about Elsie Walker was officially closed. The files were moved to the archives, where they sat undisturbed for decades. The case is now remembered as the precursor to one of the most brutal crimes in New Zealand history. A sign that the darkness in Bill Bailey had been present long before he ever set foot in the small town of Ruawaro. The first victim had been silenced by the same cold hands. I find it difficult to accept that a life can be taken without leaving a single mark on the world, as if the person simply evaporated into the night. Elsie Walker's death was a whisper that was drowned out by the scream of the later murders. But it remains the more profound mystery. Next to daughters, it represents a moment where the ordinary security of a family was breached by someone who was supposed to be a protector, leaving behind a silence that no execution could ever truly break. The orchards remember. Today, the orchards in the Bay of Plenty still grow under the same southern sun, and the gates of the farms are still locked every evening against the coming dark. The story of the girl and the car that moved through the night is a cold closing beat in the history of the district. It is a reminder that the most dangerous shadows are often the ones we invite into our homes, the ones who know the layout of the rooms and the turn of the key in the lock. The hills keep their secrets very well. As of 2026, the case of Elsie Walker remains officially unsolved, though historians and criminologists view Bill Bailey's later crimes as a definitive, if indirect, admission of his nature. Modern forensic science has recently digitized the original autopsy notes, confirming that the lack of trauma was consistent with a non-violent but terrifying ordeal. The field in Papatoetoe where she was found is now a suburban street, the bushes long gone. The memory is all that remains. The absence of a person is a physical weight, a shape left in the air that never quite fills in, no matter how much time passes over the landscape. When we look back at these stories from the middle of the 20th century, we are looking at the traces of people who were just like us, people who woke up on a Tuesday morning and expected the world to be exactly where they left it. They checked the stove, they folded the laundry, and they looked out the window at a sky that seemed entirely familiar. The objects they left behind, the silver ladle in Stockholm, the heavy wooden trunk in Santos, the tiny scrap of paper in a watch pocket, become the only remaining anchors to their existence. These items are mundane, ordinary things that were suddenly transformed into monuments of a tragedy. They sit in museum cases or police archives, holding the weight of a secret that was never meant to be told. They are the physical evidence that a life was there, and then, in a moment of misalignment, it was gone. There is a specific kind of coldness that comes from realizing how fragile the boundaries of our lives truly are. We build walls, and we lock gates, and we assume that the people we know are the people they claim to be. But the shadows of Hinterkaifeck and the silence of the Bay of Plenty remind us that the darkness does not always come from the outside. Sometimes it is already sitting at the table, sharing a meal, and planning a journey that ends in a place where the labels have all been removed. As the rain continues to fall outside tonight, I hope you find comfort in the warmth of your own home and the security of the people you trust. These stories are not meant to frighten, but to remind us of the value of the ordinary life that still moves at its natural pace. The world is a vast place, filled with mysteries that may never be solved, but the light in your window is a real and certain thing. We are all just travelers, moving through the dark, looking for a place where the gates stay locked. The stories we have shared tonight are reflections of a world that was both smaller and more mysterious than our own. They are traces of a time when a disappearance could be total and a name could be erased by a sharp blade. But even in the silence of the archives, the voices of the lost still find a way to reach us. They remind us to look closer at the things we take for granted and to cherish the moments of normalcy that define our days. The night is long, but it is not infinite. I will leave you now with the sound of the rain and the steady rhythm of the night. May your sleep be deep and your dreams be peaceful, far away from the hollow trees and the dusty streets of a forgotten city. The world will still be there in the morning, and the sun will rise over the orchards just as it did a century ago. Take care of yourself and each other. Good night.